to The Critical Path, Greater Vancouver REALTORS' professionalism and innovation-focused podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Lalime. Each episode, we sit down with industry leaders to discuss the critical issues affecting our profession and the paths we must take to overcome them. GVR's Director of Economics and Data Analytics, Andrew Lis, joins the Two Timers Club, making his second appearance on The Critical Path today, and at a fascinating time for the Metro Vancouver real estate market. Seasonal factors, external factors, and let's call them Donald Trump factors, all affecting the market. But it's really unlike anything we've seen in recent memory, and there's a lot of nuance to understanding what's really happening out there. So with that, Andrew, we're thrilled to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me back on. Really appreciate it.
So let's just start right where all the attention is. What's going on in the market right now? Like, we've seen a sluggish first half of the year from a sales perspective. Inventories climbed to record highs, sales sitting well below seasonal averages. You did cite some potential for a turnaround in your June report. Let us just give us a picture of what's going on right now.
For sure. You kind of hit the highlights there. I mean, it really is an interesting market that we've been in the past 6-7 months. You know, it's not the one that we expected. When we put out our forecast, we were certainly expecting to see a lot more sales coming in the beginning of the year. It was weird. They kind of came out flat. You know, we ended 2024 with pretty good momentum going into the end of the year. Sales were finally starting to climb up around those long-term 10-year seasonal averages. We're starting to see some real effects from what we would expect to see from all of these policy rate cuts to the Bank of Canada's policy rate. So, you know, we were sitting there thinking, okay, mortgage rates are coming down. Market seems like it's picking up. So our forecast was really reflective of that. It was saying, well, look, based on these factors that we kind of expect to see and continue to see them going forward, we're thinking this is going to be a pretty good year for sales. But as soon as January rolled around, it was a weird month. You know, it came in really flat. Then February came in, it was flat as well. And, you know, in March and so on. And we thought, like, this is a little weird. And so everybody starts looking around for answers. And of course, you know, the elephant in the room remains the elephant in the room is the Trump story, right? There was Trump's inauguration was around January. And so the market really cooled off around then. The theory that a lot of people are putting forward is that, hey, there's all this uncertainty being caused by, you know, Mr. Trump down south. And that's really rattling the markets, and it's got people, you know, worried. And so sales really started to slow down, but inventory didn't. We had a lot of sellers coming to market. And this is one of the interesting puzzles about the story, is that you'd kind of think that uncertainty would impact everybody sort of evenly in some ways, right? Why would it be that sellers are willing to participate when buyers aren't, really? You know, it's like, it's an uncertain time. If you're selling, do you really want to sell into uncertainty and so on? So it was kind of weird that one side of the market was still operating in a somewhat normal way that we would expect. But when you paired that with the slowdown in sales, what we ended up with was this big buildup of inventory that we had. As you said, we've really hit some, you know, record highs here that we haven't seen in a really long time. You know, and the opportunities that I get to talk about in media, I do try to characterize it as actually a fairly healthy level of inventory. I think it's important to stress that this market in Vancouver has been one that's been so starved for inventory so many times over and over and over again. That's why we get these big increases in prices. And that's what brings out, you know, the policy machinery off the sidelines that tries to, you know, meddle in the market in various ways, because obviously as prices rise quickly, concerns develop around affordability and so on. And then there's a whole, you know, the theories start exploding everywhere about why that may be. And we've been through that whole thing as well with the foreign buyers and all that, right? So anyhow, you know, we've had this kind of very interesting start to the year with really slow sales, big buildup in inventory. And, you know, one of the only kind of obvious things to point to is this so-called uncertainty from down south. But, you know, I have a lot of reasons to be skeptical of that argument. And, you know, people reading my blog posts, I'm sure they're familiar with at least a couple of those, but happy to, you know, dig into some of them here.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's talking about some of those blog posts, you know, it's interesting because some of those certain factors that you look for in a healthier market, things like, you know, a good supply of inventory, stable pricing, you know, interest rates, you know, falling from where they've been in the last little while. And yet we're still here in this kind of soup of like nobody really can put their finger on it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's weird too because it really is a great market for buyers, really. Like if you think about it, if I were shopping for a home, this is fantastic. You've
Right.
got tons to choose from. You got a great opportunity to get a pretty darn good interest rate that we haven't been able to see for like quite a little while. There's you got negotiating room on both ends of the deals. There's we're hearing about things people making subject to sale conditions, which is something we haven't seen in many years in the market. And these are all, I would say, fairly healthy, descriptions of a market operating the way it should. But it is a little weird to see sales kind of down where they are right now. You'd think with seasonal factors and stuff, we should have been a little bit higher than we are, especially with rates being where they are. So, is it this uncertainty weighing us from, Mr. Trump and the on off again trade war thing? Like, I don't know. I've like reasons to be skeptical. One of the main ones is in a piece that I did recently. You look across Canada at various markets and you compare, well, how are these markets performing in terms of sales relative to say something like their 10-year seasonal average, right? So you do this comparison and you look across the country and what you find is that, well, there's actually a bunch of markets that are up over their 10-year seasonal average in sales. They're in fact up by quite a bit, not just small amounts, 10, 20, 30% in some cases. And so it's like, well, those markets are doing exceptionally well. And what is it about Vancouver and Toronto to a certain extent, or actually it's more like British Columbia and Ontario? What is it about these markets that, is keeping them subdued, whereas everywhere else seems to be doing well? And one of the other interesting bits out of that analysis is that, one of the places that does seem to be doing really well is these regions that are oil producing regions. But Mr. Trump came out threatening, all kinds of tariffs against Canadian oil and stuff. And granted, lesser tariffs than some other, products and things that he was threatening about. But, still, that would be extremely damaging to the, those industries, those oil and gas producing industries. And in those regions, you're seeing sales above their 10-year averages. So it's kind of, it's weird to me to think that like somehow the so-called uncertainty just kind of stops at the border of BC and Ontario and doesn't bleed into these other places. And somehow, everyone else in the country acts differently to all of this than we do here. There's something about that story doesn't really sit right for me. And I'm still, actually just before getting on this podcast, I'm working on the second article, kind of trying to get to the bottom of this that follows up on my previous post there that, looking at a ton of factors, just trying to understand what could it be.
Yeah, we did kind of look at that as we prepped for this as well. And, at the end of that post, it was kind of, we're going to keep digging into this. There seem to be a lot more questions than answers at this point. Given that setup, let's get you to take out your crystal ball here. We all know economists have one. And just, have a look, because again, we're recording this, this is around the end of July that we're recording this, but by the time our listeners are hearing this, it's probably going to be at least a month out, maybe end of August into the beginning of September. What does your crystal ball say the rest of the year looks like?
Well, I hope I can get this one at least kind of right, because really short-term forecasts tend to be easier than the long-term ones, and we definitely didn't get the the long-term annual forecast quite right off the bat. Although there still is half the year to go, and I would say don't give up on it yet. I mean, we've seen markets before where where the market really picks up in the second half of the year. It's possible. I'm not saying it'll happen, but it's possible. With that said, what we've seen very recently in some of the data is finally the market seems like it's picking up slowly. It's just like a train starting to build some momentum. It's not like off to the races. This isn't a Formula One car sprinting off the line. This is like a slow train starting to get its momentum again. We're starting to see the sales pick up. They're coming back towards, the sales levels that we saw last year, which granted weren't, some of the most highest levels of sales we've seen in a long time, but at least it's somewhat normalizing, and we're not, it's not heading in the opposite direction of getting worse. So, I think what's to thank for a lot of that is I think some of this, hoopla with the federal election and the stuff with the US and all this stuff is, I wouldn't say fading out of memory, but fading in memory. And, people are starting to adjust what this new reality looks like. I think more and more people are maybe looking at the market and starting to actually see these opportunities that I'm talking about, especially if you're a buyer, and they're starting to realize, hey, look, lots of inventory, pretty good rates, maybe this, nothing's really going on with this whole trade thing. It's not really we haven't blown up yet. Maybe it's time to make that move. And so it does seem like there's, a little bit more momentum picking up. I'm hearing from some of our members who are reaching out to me in various times saying, I'm kind of starting to see a little bit more activity in my area. So all these little tea leaves, put them together, I think a couple months out, what we're going to see is that sales are starting to normalize. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be gangbusters, but I do think that we're going to see a bit of a pickup relative to where we've been. I'm very hopeful that continues into the end of the year so that my original forecast isn't shot, because I would love to have that one come to fruition for the end of the year. Not doing too well in our forecasting competition here. We keep an internal one that we run, and I'm somewhere middle of the pack at the moment. We have some very surprising leaders on there right now, which has been great to see. It's always a really fun kind of internal thing to do and see everybody's kind of prognostications, how they unfold. And it's I got to tell you, in the few years we've been doing it, it's always some of the most unlikely forecasts that you look at it. You look at all the data together and you say, oh, that forecast there, that's probably one that's going to be a pretty unlikely one. And those are usually the ones that come to be true. So maybe I should take a page out of their book and just do a bit more random guessing instead of playing with all these models.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because we actually put out a graph not that long ago, kind of showing a similar kind of trajectory from this year, mirroring 2020, which of course would have been right when we were kind of coming out of the pandemic, and things really kind of did hit a stride in the back half of that year. But again, at that time, maybe nobody would have been expecting it quite that much because of, again, all of the uncertainty that we were dealing with going through a global pandemic, right? So, the potentiality, like you were just saying, for that to happen here in the back half of the year does exist, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great sort of corollary there. I hadn't actually really thought about it in such a direct sense, but yeah, the pandemic, I mean, can you think of a time that's been more uncertain than that? That's been, nobody knew what was going to happen, right? You didn't even know if you were going to get toilet paper, right? So it was a pretty crazy time. And, to see a market pick up out of that. Now, one of the factors, however, there is we had interest rates hit the floor during that, right? So that was one of the factors that we don't have right now. I mean, interest rates are down, but they're not down like they were around the pandemic. Those were emergency levels of low interest rates, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, I suppose there's a possibility we could see somewhat lower rates, especially if we start seeing some, negative effects on the economy, if GDP starts slowing, these kinds of things. Bank of Canada is going to be put in a bit of a pinch, and they're going to have to make a decision about, we're going to go a bit lower here to stimulate the economy, cushion any blows from the US, or are we going to maintain what we've been doing to try to, keep inflation under control, as they've been doing actually a fairly good job of up to this point. So, there is this potential for a little bit lower on the rate side, but I don't foresee any emergency rate cuts of the kind we saw in, the pandemic. But I really like the corollary there to the uncertainty level, because that was really, it's hard to imagine a time that was crazier than that.
Yeah, I mean, and that was a global pandemic and not, a national leader, for lack of a better term, kind of intentionally screwing with things. But,
tweeting his policy out 140 characters at a time. Yeah, it's kind of nuts, but it is what it is. It's what we're living through. And,
it's not
something.
Give
the guy credit. I mean, he won the election, so there you go. They voted for him, so it is what it is.
Fair enough. And again, at the end of the day, it's the world we're living in, right? It's a reality that we just kind of have to deal with. So, what are as we're looking at this kind of crystal ball projection of what might be coming down the road, what are some of the kind of key factors that you think could swing things in one direction or the other?
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, rates was one of those ones. Like that's always a factor that we look at pretty closely as economists. I mean, we like to believe there's a fairly strong relationship between interest rates and sales, and like historically there is, and that's why we tend to believe this data. Another thing though is like we've had these big policy shifts at the federal level. One around immigration levels, right? There's been a big adjustment to these numbers. When I started here, I remember writing some pieces that were like, saying, hey, look, Canada's expected to grow, BC's expected to grow in population levels significantly over the next, foreseeable future. Interestingly, only a few years after I wrote those, of course, the federal government decides to change course a bit, and now they've reversed some of those policy. I mean, I wouldn't say completely reversed. They've altered them, let's say, to significantly reduce the inflows of people coming to our country. And as a result of that, British Columbia and Ontario are two of the primary destinations where, immigrants come to in our country. And so, that could be one of those factors that has a big impact on our market. Now, are they going to make any changes to those changes again? Are they going to amend the changes to the changes? It's unclear. It is like we've got the Carney government in there who doesn't seem to be indicating there's going to be changes to those policies, but you kind of never know. It's a bit of a wild card there. It could be the case that they discover like, well, actually, by the changes that we've made to these adjustments, this is actually going to really hurt our economic growth, and we've got to kind of go back to what we were doing before. There could be all kinds of considerations. Of course, this was this federal government that came in with a big housing component of their platform. And, with that in mind, I think it's sort of unlikely they're going to be rolling back those immigration targets the way, back to what they were before, because they're really trying to ease that pressure on the housing market. And they're looking on a lot of ways of, introducing more non-market housing and kind of social housing, and government playing a bigger role in the development of housing. So that'll be an interesting thing to see. The degree to which that kind of impacts our market here, I think, will be somewhat limited for now, because these are longer term policy goals. You're getting something like Canada Builds up and running is a multi-year, initiative, and then the effects of that are multi-year later. So nothing. I wouldn't foresee anything too immediate. There could be some tweaks to some of the policies that we've seen at the more local level here in British Columbia. There's been a bit of BCREA has been, banging the table a little bit about short-term rent changes to the short-term rental bylaws. I think some of those would be some positive improvements where, there's a lot of communities relying on short-term rental income essentially to stay afloat and employ people and whatnot. And I think it was a big oversight in a lot of that policy that they rolled out. And I think that there's, quite a bit of collateral damage from that, more so than I think they probably anticipated. And it's probably time that they took a good, strong look at that policy and reevaluated the impacts. But again, that would be a fairly small factor impacting us going forward. Really the biggies is kind of interest rates and seeing if people start coming off the sidelines, if we start to normalize here. I think one of the components that's been missing, at least I've been hearing anecdotally from some members, is investors just not really calling so much right now. So, is that going to be a thing that picks up in the future? I hope so. I hope to see that come back in, because that's really needed for new housing supply, as well as for providing more and more rental housing for people in the region. So, hopefully that kind of picks up. But it's really, I think, just a kind of looking down the barrel of the rest of the year. It's kind of like, are we going to see those folks, that pent up demand, if you will? Are we going to see it come off the sidelines? I'm hopeful that we will, and I think there's reasons to believe it will. Like I said, we've got a great market for buyers right now, and sellers, I think, are starting to adjust to price expectations a little bit here, where they realize, been on the market 3 or 4 months here, it's not selling. Maybe it's time to lower that price 100,000 or whatever and get on with life. So I think as those things kind of all work themselves out, I think we'll start seeing, sales normalize a bit more as we're starting to see right now. And so hopefully I'm not wrong about that, because it's always embarrassing to make a very short-term forecast and have it be so off.
But you were getting into some of those kind of dynamics about, price and, days on market and that kind of stuff. I actually wanted to get into that next. So it was kind of a perfect segue, because these are metrics that our clients are using fairly regularly, right, in their work to try and convey what's going on in the market to their clients. Days on market, price reduction data, they seem like helpful guides when you're buying or selling. But some members do say that what they're seeing on the ground doesn't quite match what the data is telling them. Is that just a question of the metrics themselves being slightly unreliable, or are they just kind of being misunderstood? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a super good question, and lots of parts to it. I'll try to do my best to keep this whole story straight, but it's a bit of a long one, so bear with me here. So I've been hearing from some members and folks who've been saying, hey, it seems like there's a lot more price changes than we've seen recently, and it seems like stuff's sitting on the market a lot more than it used to be, which generally is kind of true. Like we can find this out from the data, but there's more to the story than that. Because when you look at something, when you think about a metric like something like days on market, well, it's a metric that it's a counter that starts when the property is kind of listed and then, ends when the property is sold. And like, there's different ways to count this as well. There's sort of like if a property gets relisted or has a major change to it or something, the days on market counter can reset. So you can reset down to 0 days on market after some adjustment. So if you're looking at properties purely on this days on market measure, you may be kind of understating the true amount of days that properties have been on the market because of this ability to reset the counter through various, and a lot of these things could happen for administrative reasons and things like that, not necessarily some sort of gaming of the system or something like a lot of people seem to believe. There's some sort of, agents out there are juicing the stats by switching things around. I think that's a bit of a not entirely a truthful story there, because there's a lot of valid reasons for, having a change to a listing, such as you enter, the price is supposed to be 5 million, but you accidentally enter it as 500,000. Well, I think you need to make a change to that listing, So those kinds of reasons happen all the time. And so that's in the data and it's there. And so that's going to kind of, as I said, sort of tends to understate the true amount of days that properties have been in the market. Now, in the back end of the system, we have the ability to look at the cumulative days of properties been on market. So that's a little bit different. It doesn't have a counter that resets every time the property has some change to it. It counts from the first day it was listed till the day it's sold, pure and simple. And so that counter, when you add that up and look at it compared to something like the typical days on market that you might find in something like StatCenter, you can see that there's been over the past year or so kind of an increase in that cumulative days on market on average relative to days on market. What that's telling us is that there is some truth to this story, that properties are sitting on the market longer. They have been sitting on the market longer. There's another dimension to this that gets a little bit like more complicated to explain it, but you think about it like if properties aren't selling, okay, well, what properties are going to be in the system, or property, if we have slow sales and so on, what properties are going to be entering the system with days on market stats? Well, they're going to be ones that have taken longer to sell. That's the nature of a slower market. And so like that days on market counter, that metric is also going to be a reflection of the slowness of the market as well. And so the time frame that you're looking at for some of these things tends to matter. And maybe a better example is looking at something like price changes as well, where, we're hearing that people are making a lot more price changes to properties, price adjustments, so on. Well, it's partially true, but again, you have to think about that from a kind of time dimension. It's like, well, if we were to look at the data and count it up, say, how many price changes do we observe in the market over the last week or so? Well, it's not going to be a terribly huge number. But let's say we expand our time horizon and say, well, how many price changes have there been over the last month? Well, we're going to get a bigger number. Well, what about over 2 months, over 3 months, over 4 months? Well, we can just keep doing that and expanding, and we get a bigger and bigger and bigger number. So to a degree, you can kind of make the number of price changes happening in the market almost whatever you want, right? So you got to kind of have some consistent time frame that you're looking at. It's like, well, what are we looking at properties that, haven't sold within a month that we're looking at, we're counting up the price changes and so on. So it's a bit of a murky measure there. But with that said, you can sort of fix a time window and say, okay, let's just consider properties that have, been on the market 90 days or so. And we look at something like that. And yeah, it does seem like there's been a bit more price adjustment. Like we've seen the sale price to list price ratio. That's a kind of interesting measure where, you're comparing what the property was ultimately sold for relative to its list price. Again, you can do this to the original list price as well. And you're seeing bigger discounts there than we have seen historically. It was around, past few years or whatever, maybe if you look at like a 10-year average, the market total or something, the number might be around 98% is your sale price to list price ratio. But these days, 96%. Might not seem like a big difference, but take that extra 2% on a $2 million property, this is a pretty good chunk of change. So, those are some of the dynamics that we're seeing in the market on that side of things. Those metrics they can be tricky. I'm trying to find some ways actually to package those up in more accessible ways to members that make a lot more sense and maybe are a little bit more intuitive than some of the ways that we've presented them before. And I mean, honestly, some of the reasons we don't present them is like due to the complication of calculating them and explaining it all. But again, like I said, I'm trying to find some ways that we can bring a lot more of this information to the forefront and provide it to members in ways that's consumable, easy to understand, and easy to share with clients and so on. That's going to be one of the big key pieces for me over the coming year. However long they'll have me here, we'll see. That's really one of my goals, is try to expand that significantly.
When you're interpreting market data, there's a lot to keep in mind, right? And that was just one example of how, you really need to provide a little bit of structure to the data in order for it to really kind of tell you a more accurate story, right? And that's just one of those nuances that people might not have just kind of on their own, right? You talked a little bit about, making this stuff a little bit more digestible, a little bit more easy to kind of take away. What kind of specific things are we working on here at GVR with you and your team to help realtors better understand and use data in their day-to-day work?
Yes, a great question. We started, we have, first of all, it's a very small team. It's myself and two staff who are very great guys, and they're really pleasure to work with, and smart, intelligent people, really putting their effort in every day. But we are a small team. We're not huge. And we're trying to do a lot with very little. We're not one of the biggest, well-resourced units in the entire organization. Not complaining here, just saying that it's just the reality of things. And that's fine. We kind of enjoy the challenge of being scrappy and trying to do what we can with what we have. I often think of us as a bit of like a startup within a mid-sized corporation or something. It feels a lot like that sometimes. And so what we're kind of trying to do right now, well, we're not kind of, we very much are trying to do this. We started with things like, this economics microsite. We needed some kind of outlet to get some of this content out to the public and members. Now, that is a public and member-facing product. So, there's limitations to what we want to provide on that. We don't want to just give away, all of our data and all of our great stuff that we're doing to the public for free. So we're looking right now at, some more advanced sort of setups that would involve having, members only access areas where we're going to, provide content, economic content, some of which might not make it to the public facing blogs. Some would be for members only. And I think that makes sense in a lot of places where, the context or the understanding of some of the topics I'd like to cover, things like this days on market and so on that we were just talking about. If I were to write a piece about that, put it out publicly, there could be some misinterpretations from media and so on, because you have to be very careful about the messaging. But, our members deal with this data and this information every day. They kind of understand the market. So it's a lot easier to communicate this to them without misunderstandings, right? So really looking forward to having an outlet for that. That's really like a members only kind of place to get that kind of information. But building on that as well, we want to really reimagine the statistics that we have. Like there's this service reimagined initiative that we have, and I mean, we're not exactly the same component of that because we're not exactly like service in our department, but I do think of us as a service of sorts of creating this valuable information and so on. So from that sense of things, like I am trying to reimagine that service. What does that look like for the future for members? And currently the way that things are, in my opinion, from the day that I started here to even today, it's sort of like we could do better in terms of giving members accessible information and, having this packaged in ways that's consumable, easy to get, or easy to slip into reports or slip into your website or whatever it may be. So we're looking at more advanced tools and products and data specifically that we want to start releasing in ways that's going to be members only access and, ability to kind of pipe this information into whatever product or tool or whatever it is they might be using. Now, as part of that, we have some initiatives of reimagining the entire statistics package. So one of the things we have is like, a fairly limited set of stats that we currently released to the public and even internally. It's not hundreds of statistics, right? Or different kind of statistics. It's the usual sales, like inventory, this kind of. But you can imagine there's millions of other ways to crunch this data and different ways to look at it. So we want to create all of those measures and we want to make all of them available to the membership. And we want to continue doing that. We want to continue innovating on it, as there's, as new data comes out or new data sets get built, you can create new measures continuously. There's no end to this essentially. Now, we also want to balance this with not overwhelming people. I mean, there's certain people who want to go down the rabbit hole like that, somebody like myself, but not everybody wants that. We know that. So we want to make certain products that are very simple, easy for people to use, easy to access, easy to consume, understand, and easy to relay to their clients. So that'll be a big focus of what we're doing going forward here. Maybe a bit slow on some of the rollout of some of these things because we are hemmed in by some technological shifts that we're doing here internally at the board. They're big shifts. They take time, they take resources, they take money and some patience. But the good news is they're underway, and it means that we're on the right course towards making these big changes. And so I'm very hopeful that in the coming years, we're going to be able to release some really big things for members. Lots of major improvements over what we've had here, like huge light years above what we've been doing here historically. And so, that's my goal. Until I'm finished with that goal, I'm committed to being here. So I hope they'll have me for a while I get to fulfill that.
And just for the members who are curious, our economics microsite, that's economics.gvrealtors.ca. And you can find all of Andrew's stuff up there, his posts, any of the other kind of charts and information that GVR Economics produces. And of course, we'll be on the ball too, sharing news about all these things on the member news site, and that's membernews.gvrealtors.ca. So as long as our members are kind of plugged in and tuning in, when these things are ready to roll out, we'll be talking about them loudly for members to hear about. So, Andrew, this has been great. Is there anything else kind of important you think members need to keep in mind in this particular kind of market, or any other kind of final parting words?
Before jumping to that, I mean, I just to reiterate something on the last point, I kind of forgot to mention, I don't want to make it sound like we are waiting away in the wings to release some big one-time big release for members of a huge change. The way that I'm looking at making these improvements over time here with our group is incremental. So, it might not seem like a lot of big deals every month, whatever it might be. But over time, we intend that effect to compound into something that is very large. It'll just be a slower rollout. We're going to do it piece by piece. As soon as it's ready to go, we're going to launch it, sort of thing. So, but yeah, back to your other question there, what's going on? What should people be expecting over the next little bit? Like I said, hang tight. I think we've got a market that does seem to be turning around. I am hopeful that we're going to see a pickup in the back half of the year. Might not be the gangbusters year that we saw coming out of COVID because, we had that massive decline in rates, and people basically cooped up at home, sitting there on Realtor app or whatever, shopping for new homes. So
dying to get out there.
We need to shut everybody in actually for a couple months and to get a big boom out of the market here.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome. This has been great, Andrew. Thank you again for sharing your insights with us today. As he mentioned, Andrew and his team are always looking at new, engaging, and informative ways of sharing data and information that you can use to make a difference with your clients and in your real estate business. If you have questions, thoughts, or just want to learn more about GVR's economics offerings, email Andrew and his team at economics@gvrealtors.ca. Thanks for listening. I'm Jesse Lalime, and I'll see you down the next critical path.